The last topic we're going to be talking about as it relates to adolescence is going to be about psychosocial problems, so sort of problematic behaviors. Next, after this, we're going to be talking about emerging adulthood. That'll be after the Easter break. And we'll talk about how emerging adulthood is different than adolescence. But before we do that, let's talk about some general principles about problems in adolescence. I'm sorry that so many points appear all on one slide. Usually I would have these come up one at a time, but that's harder to do in this format. That said, there are lots of individuals who believe that adolescence is this time of storm and stress or this time of problematic behavior. We've already talked about how the word teen alone is or could have a negative connotation. And there are these general findings about this period known as adolescence in regards to problematic behaviors. And so the points here represent research findings when we look at adolescence as a whole group. So first and foremost, most adolescents go through this time period just fine, no real difficulty. In times past, I've asked my students to raise their hand if they think that overall, and not to say that you didn't have arguments with your parents or perhaps you didn't, you did engage in some risk-taking behaviors, but overall went through adolescence, okay. And most students say that this is true for them. So when we're talking about adolescence as a whole, this means that not all adolescents are having significant problems. However, what we do know, and this probably is not surprising at all to you, is that the media exaggerates problems. This could be in terms of actually what we see on the news, like juvenile delinquents. It could be what we see in TV shows when they're portraying adolescents as extremely moody to the point of being really problematic or getting into trouble. And essentially, the media is a source of this stereotype that adolescence just equals problems. But again, that's not true. Most adolescents go through this time period just fine. For some problems that emerge, so today we're going to be talking about substance use and abuse, and then also depression and some other mental health issues. But when we talk about substance abuse, if an adolescent has some problems, and I use that word loosely, oftentimes it is just transitory, meaning it's not permanent. If we have an adolescent who's engaging in binge drinking, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be somebody who has a substance abuse problem for the rest of their lives or even into early adulthood. So it's more reflective of an experiment or experimentation, and we'll talk about how that could still be negative in an adolescent's life rather than this deep-seated issue that's going to cause problems in functioning later on in life. If we do see problems in adolescence, so again, let's go back to substance abuse and or just deviant behavior broadly, it's often the case that it's not that adolescence itself caused this person to develop these problems. Usually these problems have developmental roots. This means that perhaps they had problematic behaviors in childhood. You see this point right here that crime and issues with internalizing problems can start as early as preschool. So when we see adolescents who are acting out or who are getting in trouble, it's not adolescence itself as a period that's been like suddenly, I'm an adolescent, now I'm going to go hurt people and or hurt myself. But oftentimes they have family situations and or genetic issues that are leading them to have problems even earlier. So again, not just adolescence. In general, most problems don't persist into adulthood. We'll talk more about that as we go on, and I've already talked about it a little bit. And I just want to be super clear that if we do see problems in adolescence, whether this is related to mental health or it's related to, substance abuse is also mental health, but it's not just caused by these biological changes like puberty. It's not caused necessarily by the need to rebel or an identity crisis. It's not caused by any one factor, first of all, or typically that's the case. It's a combination of factors, and it's not this period of adolescence that is driving it. There are many factors that could be at play. So we have these stereotypes, maybe not you, but others in society have these stereotypes of adolescents as being deviant or up to no good or getting into trouble with their peers. But for most, that's just simply not the case. All right, so first we're going to be talking about substance use and abuse. And I'm going to provide some data for you right here on prevalence rates. It's not so important to me that you know the specific numbers because these are going to vary from sample to sample. What's important is that you realize the general pattern. So in this particular study, and this was a representative study, so again, not just white students from the Midwest, but more broad than that. They were asking seniors in high school data based on the last month of their lives. What we don't know is which month this was assessed. So this could differ because you could imagine that seniors who are at the end and are experiencing things like prom or graduation parties might be engaging in behaviors differently than at the beginning of the year, for example. So I don't know when this data was collected necessarily. That said, in this particular sample, about 66% of these seniors said that they had drank alcohol. 44% said that they had smoked marijuana. 34% said that they had smoked cigarettes. And 8% said they engaged with other drugs. These numbers may or may not be surprising to you. For some of you, you may expect that these individual substances may be used even more than reported here. For some, you might say, hey, that seems really high. Students in general tend to think that this 34% smoking cigarettes seems really high, and this is from data from 2015, so it's really not that long ago. I don't know if they're also including vaping in that or not. Nevertheless, what you see most is that seniors say that they're drinking alcohol more than anything else. When we talk about their day-to-day behaviors, which is different than in the last month, because that could have been just a one-time use, 10% said they smoke daily, so that would have been cigarettes there. 7% said that they smoked marijuana daily, and 2% said that they drank alcohol daily. I think for me, the 2% is pretty surprising because to drink alcohol every day is indicative of a problem. In terms of binge drinking, a term that you've heard a lot about in your college career and will continue to learn more about it, they were asked about this in regards to the last 2 weeks. And this was a survey that wasn't just done on seniors. So you can see that 20% of seniors said that they had an episode of binge drinking in the 2 weeks prior to the study. 15% of sophomores, but I think this is also a really surprising 6% of 8th graders, these are 13 to 14-year-olds, also said that they had at least one episode of binge drinking in the last 2 weeks. So you see developmental differences for sure. Again, thinking about 13 and 14-year-olds, it's definitely scarier. But 20% of seniors are saying that this is something that they engage in. So what is the overall pattern? The overall pattern is that the typical adolescent does experiment with alcohol, maybe marijuana, maybe some tobacco, but not really other drugs, or it's not as common. Again, this is the typical adolescent. And by far, alcohol, even if you're not looking at this study, but you're looking at other studies, is the most commonly used and abused substance. There is this famous study called Monitoring the Future study. It's a longitudinal study, but it also looks at generational differences. It's a well-known study in the world of not just developmental psychology, but even public health. And what this study has found recently is that substance use rates haven't gotten worse. So you may have heard of millennials and our Generation Z individuals being more likely to use drugs, but really that is more of a stereotype than based in reality. The rates haven't gotten better either, though, so rates have stayed pretty stable. The one big change that has happened is that regardless of the data that is presented here, teen smoking rates have gone down. We know less and less teens who are smoking cigarettes. Obviously, with the rise of vaping, then we just don't have enough data on that yet, at least in comparison. We don't have any data comparison to previous generations other than it didn't exist. So the whole purpose for this slide is to talk about how common are some of these substances, how often are they being used. And you see there's quite a bit of variability, and these data only represent 1 or 2 studies and not necessarily every study that's done on the topic recently.